You know, every year as this end of year period approaches, our minds, of course, are usually filled with the approaching holiday season, seeing everyone we love and all the celebrations. And while we know that obviously this year that's going to be more toned down, it's going to be a little bit different, and some of those people are going to maybe only be on Zoom. The fact is that we're really thinking about each other, or ideally thinking about each other one way or another. At heart, it's the season of love, and we're supposed to be thinking about each other at that level. And in practical terms, it's the season of giving, and we have to think about that as well. One thing we might have discovered during the course of this challenging year is about when people really need something, when we have new opportunities to give something and give of ourselves. And some of the best that came out of the lockdown period was seeing the incredible generosity of people and seeing people rise to the occasion to give in situations that they may have been aware of it before or not, but that it brought something out of them. And of course, that's the original idea of the holiday season, the Christmas spirit, everything about this time of the year that is really meant to remind us to reconnect in some way. And perhaps it does raise the question of why. Because when I talk about that, when I talk about the giving, we've also all got that thought is, yes, the holidays is really now all just about presents and it's a whole commercial thing. And that's one of the big issues. We often hear people expressing about the Christmas season, it's all just about commercial. And that's because of the giving and receiving of gifts. And it raises the question, is that all that it's about? The real question is, why do we give? And what is it about giving that is beneficial to us in some way? Is it beneficial to us? Is it beneficial to the receiver? And what is it about giving that makes it so important in our world? So, why do we give? Is it that we care? I mean, what happened in lockdown, people saw other people in need, they felt the urge to rise to the occasion. Is it just that they care? Or do we give because it makes us feel good? Maybe we'll also have to pop in on the subject of, do we give because we get something back in return? So that is always a possibility. But it's always been asserted, and traditionally the kind of psychological view of ourselves is that it's our values and our ability to love and receive love that give us our sense of well-being and health, emotional health as a human being. And in that value system, that ethical, loving value system that gives us our sense of value as a human being, generosity and gratitude, giving and receiving, are amongst the most important personality characteristics that show a person of good character, or good moral or ethical character. So that's actually Eric Fromm who says this. And so some of our most core values are that, with this care for each other and this ability to give when we have to and be grateful when we get. I mean, don't we learn that saying please and thank you are the golden rule? Isn't it the most core thing that we teach children from a very early age, is to say please and thank you, and the whole negotiation of giving and receiving, which is something that's so very important. But further than that, psychologists also say that there's a direct link between the behavior of being generous and psychological health. Not only just because we're expressing those core values of generosity and gratitude, but also because we give out of a sense of abundance. That when we give, we've got a sense of abundance. And so the psychologist Maslow said that generosity is connected to abundance and produces good psychological health. And on the other hand, selfish behavior is associated with people who've got a kind of a neurotic inner life where they worry about things all the time, especially about themselves, and where they have little to give of themselves or anything else. People who don't give of themselves or give of their resources, is what he's saying, who experience a kind of a fear and anxiety about letting go of anything, do not have that inner sense of abundance and are perhaps in poorer psychological health. Bottom line is, giving is associated with good psychological health. It's interesting that there is a lot of research on giving and on generosity, and it seems to me that there are two perhaps connected reasons why there's so much research on it. One is the desire to understand altruism in human beings. Where does it really come from? I mean, we've often been possessed of the idea of whether we're naturally selfish creatures or naturally generous creatures. What is our instinctive nature really? We've lost so much sight of so much of our instinctive behavior that we've got to do scientific studies to find out what it is. So the search for altruism and the origin of altruism seems to be one source of that. And the other source is marketing of usually fundraising schemes, but other places where people have to give. So there's quite an outcomes-oriented, perhaps materialistic approach to some of the research on generosity that is basically asking the question, how or when are people more likely to donate? Who is more likely to donate? And those are legitimate questions. Marketing around fundraising is unmistakably necessary because, people obviously have to be made aware of opportunities to give, and the receivers of those funds need to also try and take advantage of those situations where people are ready to give. So, what is it about that generosity? What is it about that altruism? So, there is no doubt that all such studies show that generosity is associated with good mental health. People who are stable and largely happy. Happy is a word you find in the psychological quest and the quest of the great philosophers. How do we become happy, or how do we be happy? At least it's one angle sometimes on what it is that we're trying to find out about ourselves. So generosity is associated with people who are happier, also with people who feel that they belong to a community or to people of like mind in some way. So people who feel that connection and belongingness usually have better mental health, usually are more happy, and also are more generous. And that's sometimes why people who are not well adjusted or who have mental challenges or whatever often are disconnected from the people around them. Very often don't have strong community. In fact, one of the probable reasons why in traditional communities people with mental challenges are kept in the community and given roles in the community is because it's one of the ways to make them healthier, to make their lives and the community's lives less difficult, is by giving them a sense of still connecting. And so it's that sense of connection that helps us maintain good health, that raises our altruism. I mean, it is true that, and there's even research that shows it, that often people are more likely to give when they at least think they're going to get something in return, and it almost goes without saying. If there is a reward, we are likely to give, and it's also when we feel indebted to the other that we're more likely to give. That could be because they've given us in the past. But research shows that that isn't enough to explain the behavior. And I think that's what's important about it. There's certainly plenty of research that shows, when one nation has donated to another nation, that second nation feels indebted, and even when they're poor or challenged, will often run to the other nation's help in return at some points in the future, down to the small scale of we obviously feel obligated and someone's done you a favor, all of that. The bottom line is that's not the same as generosity. Recognizing that that someone helped us and appreciating that help, firstly, doesn't automatically make us feel indebted to them, doesn't automatically do that. And secondly, as I was saying, generosity seems to be a different behavior or is somehow on top of that because it arises out of our own altruism and our own sense of mental health, happiness, and belonging. It's really important that the generous action is not actually about seeking profit or seeking reward. And that's why there are different things. Feeling indebted and fulfilling a debt is not in fact the same psychological motive as feeling generous and acting from a point of ethics and natural good balanced mental health. A really truly generous action doesn't need to get anything in return, does not seek to make anyone owe something in return, and doesn't happen because of selfish satisfaction. It's true and it's important that we feel a lot of satisfaction from the act of giving, but it's also important that that isn't the reason that we give. And there's even some evidence to show that. The happiness that we feel as a reward for something or after particular activity diminishes the more often we do it or the more often we experience it. It is sadly true for pretty much everything. The more often you do it, the more regular it becomes, the less it's able to induce the excitement or the happiness or something similar that it did induce at the beginning. That is called hedonic adaptation. We adapt to pleasure. So, under normal circumstances, the more we do something, the less happiness it generates in return for us. But interestingly, giving doesn't seem to work that way. Studies again show, and plenty of people's personal experience of course shows, that the more you give does not reduce the amount of satisfaction that you get from giving. It's psychologist Ed O'Brien who says that normally if you want to sustain happiness for a long period of time from a particular activity, you have to keep on taking breaks from it, which most of us know to be true. The results are different with generosity, because even when the same behavior is repeated over and over again, it continues to feel fresh as if people were taking a break. So people never kind of tire from the experience of generosity. It feels like a new experience almost every time that they're doing it. And for some people it can even feel more pleasurable the more often they do it. It goes again contrary to the usual things that make us feel satisfied from doing something. And there actually is a good reason why we adapt to pleasure. We really adapt to everything. It's functional in this case. So, one of the things that we all know is that if you don't keep up a language, you forget about it. If you don't keep up any particular knowledge, you quickly forget it. Playing an instrument or something you learnt, a course or whatever. And it feels like a flaw. I remember the whole language. How did I lose that? And what that's really about is adaptation, that we adapt to new knowledge. So if there's no longer a reason to be carrying around this other language and we're not using it for any reason, it's archived somehow. Not really forgotten, but it's archived. And it's harder to access or slower to access or something like that. It's a form of adaptation. And adaptation to pleasure is also functional because it makes us seek out new resources. If we get contented with the same thing over and over again, we could also run out of that thing, but we stop looking for other things. So we need to find new resources. So the theory is that that's why we adapt to pleasure, so that we pursue new resources. But again, generosity doesn't seem to be the same kind of pleasure, doesn't generate the same results. Another reason that then also is why, for the most part, the reason why people keep on giving to charity is not directly related to reward, is because research has discovered that when people focus on an outcome, such as a reward, they then will compare that outcome to other experiences. I got less this time, so it's not worth it. I'll get more if I change and go over there. So the sensitivity to the experience itself gets less, and the sensitivity to the reward increases. But when people donate to a charity, it seems as if they don't really focus on comparison, and they tend to therefore experience each giving experience as a unique event that produces its own reward. They don't usually compare it because there isn't a reason to, really. So that falls away, and each one seems to be, here's a great reward. Here's a reward I didn't expect. And the reward really is the happiness. The reward is literally the brain lighting up. And there's been a lot of research, I'll talk about in a second, that is about what really happens in the brain when we give. Why is it? Where's this reward that is good enough on its own terms? And each act of giving is a happiness-inducing event, and that defies comparison with any other reward. There is something similar to reward, if you like, and that is that we don't adapt to that kind of happiness because giving and being generous improves our standing in the society, or it makes us a better person. So even if it's not in others' eyes and they don't know about it, because we can give anonymously, it still relates to our sense of an ethical human being. So it can reinforce our sense of, I'm a good person, I belong to the society. They may or may not know about my charitable act, but I'm connected to the society, and that itself is the kind of, the reward is in itself, which is, I suppose, part of the nature of ethical behavior, is that to an ethical person, it's presumably good enough just to be ethical. That's the whole purpose. So it's that reward that's reinforcing itself. So I suppose, not unexpectedly then, people are more likely to give when they have a clear ethical system, whether that's because of religion or because of education, even because of wealth, or sometimes because they live in a smaller community, which is a good enough reason sometimes as well for strong ethics to be maintained. And also very importantly in our understanding of this year, is also that people are more likely to give when they understand the need they are fulfilling, and when they can relate to it in some way, or relate to whatever that cause is. So there's always this human quality that's in there. So again, there's no reward in that. It's just the sense of relating, realizing this is another human being. There is something about giving that pulls on our higher nature. We don't only have to have a high ethic in order to give, but giving seems to bring to the surface these higher ethics in us. Certainly, at the simplest level, we know that giving and generosity relates to a greater satisfaction in life. And it's true that the more people give, this is from a Harvard study, the more satisfaction about life they actually get. In terms of overall happiness and satisfaction in life, it does boil down to the more you give, the more satisfied you feel. And it doesn't only have to be in the giving of money or of things. People have also shown that the stuff that we do in the neighborhood, helping other people, running errands or helping them with meals, all these things that people did during lockdown and hopefully do at plenty other times as well, produces that sense of reward and happiness. And one study actually showed that communities that had a higher rate of people helping each other had a much lower mortality rate. People died less frequently in those communities. And that's a very, very powerful, kind of visceral illustration of what that happiness and that quality that I'm talking about actually means. That there's a deeper, life-affirming quality to giving that literally supports physical life itself. But even though the more you give, the more happiness you experience, the more contentment, it does not mean you have to give a lot in order to do that. So then there were these studies where they actually, they put electrodes on the brain and they can see which areas of the brain light up when people give. And they discovered that even under the most, the smallest of generous circumstances, the smallest giving causes the pleasure and contentment areas of the brain to light up on the electrodes. The more you give, maybe more so, but the fact is, even giving the smallest amount gave people that warm, glowing feeling. We know that warm, fuzzy feeling when you're generous. It literally is, of course, your brain producing that pleasurable feeling, and that response in your brain occurs even when you give a small amount. You don't have to lay down everything you have in order to give. Just being generous at any level gives. And further research even showed that just committing to giving even does that. So you know how when they have telethons and people phone up and pledge money, and you always wonder, well, are they just saying it? Actually, it's part of the experience of giving. I think some of them, it might be all they need to do, because it does produce the same positive emotions in the brain. But it's also probable that that's why they follow it up anyway, that it continues to expand. It is a commitment. Hopefully it's a legal commitment. And as I said, even committing to giving produces the same response in the brain as actually doing the giving itself. Why that is important is that because what we call just, the brain lights up when we look at with the machine, is that there are actually chemical changes in the brain that are caused by our behaviors. So neural activity happens, and the researchers find it remarkable that neural activity occurs even with the intent to act in a certain way, promising to behave in a certain way. And they suggest that promising to behave generously could actually be used as a strategy to reinforce that behavior in people in one way and at one level, and to actually make them feel happier on the other level. It's a win-win situation. If you promise to behave generously, you get a good result. It also makes you feel happier, which makes you want to be generous. And so that's why you follow through with the pledge. It's not just a reinforcement, it's that it literally brings out the ethic in you. It brings out that higher, greater human behavior. And there is a very important principle that's going on there that underlies that whole experience of giving. And that is that when we experience ourselves as a giver, we get a real, powerful, and lasting reinforcement, affirmation of our own value to other people, of our own value in our world and in our community. And in transcending ourselves, we get in return the most profound experience of ourselves. That is what giving does for us. So at a time of a year and at a particular year when we might be less able to be generous in the usual way, and we might not want to or be in a position to run around and shop as a way of displaying our generosity, remember every little bit of generosity at every little level means the same, and that anything that you do or make in the spirit of generosity is in fact the spirit of love and humanity that the holiday season is supposed to represent. That is within our grasp in any year, and maybe especially in this year. So, have a great festive season. I'll be seeing you here at the same time next week.